basic arguments. First, quote, "The reason for poverty is not some personal failing, but the accident of being born to the wrong parents or the lack of opportunity to become non-poor or some other circumstance over which individuals have no control." Second, racial discrimination had exacerbated the problem of poverty for some. According to the commission, quote, "The greater incidence of poverty among non-whites was the result of direct or indirect discrimination in employment, education, housing, and other areas." Third, a guaranteed income without preconditions could be implemented quickly, help to mitigate the effects of poverty, and pave the way for economic mobility. Quote, "Our main recommendation is for the creation of a universal income supplement, financed and administered by the federal government, making cash payments to all members of the population with income needs," unquote. What I'm interested in here today is how the President's Commission on Income Maintenance arrived at those conclusions, which shifted the onus of poverty away from individual choice to structures, systems, and institutions, and how the Commission came to recommend guaranteed income. I argue that the Commission, which has received little attention in the historical scholarship, utilized an investigative strategy which provides an important case study for understanding how face-to-face interactions can shape the views of decision makers about poverty, poverty policy, and specifically about guaranteed income. Interactions between commissioners who served on the President's Commission on Income Maintenance and activists, local officials, and the poor themselves over the course of 1968 and 1969 challenged commissioners' perspectives about poverty, recast the poor as independent and resourceful, and underscored the role of systems and structures in perpetuating cyclical poverty. While poverty rates have been declining since the start of Johnson's War on Poverty in 1964, certain pockets of poverty among African Americans and other minorities, for example, had remained stubbornly high. In 1969, the African American poverty rate remained at 32%. At the same time, the percentage of whites living below the poverty line was 9.5%. In addition, other problems associated with low wages, automation, and underemployment had become increasingly intractable for all working Americans, regardless of race and ethnicity. In 1966, for example, a third of all poor families remained below the poverty line, despite the fact that the head of household was fully or nearly fully employed. A full-time work schedule of 40 hours per week, 52 weeks per year at the 1968 minimum wage did not raise a family of four above the poverty line. In addition, many minimum wage jobs were also unstable. Sudden termination was a frequent occurrence, and unemployment insurance rarely provided a soft landing. As a result of these problems and others, a growing chorus of organizations and leaders in the 1960s pushed for guaranteed income. Indeed, interest in the idea of guaranteed income had grown among leaders on the left and the right, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Milton Friedman. By some accounts, even Lyndon Johnson, whose War on Poverty emphasized, quote, "the long-run creation of opportunities in employment, housing, and education rather than income transfer programs, had supported guaranteed income by the late 1960s. In fact, a senior Johnson domestic policy advisor had noted that the administration was already committed to the implementation of guaranteed income even before Johnson had created the President's Commission on Income Maintenance. Quote, "The President's Commission on Income Maintenance was not set up because the administration had any doubts that income maintenance was necessary, but only because we had to get blue-chip, prestigious commissioners on the line for something that was highly radical at the time." The Commission's membership was a marriage of influential constituencies, a racially and ethnically diverse group of distinguished men and women from across the political spectrum and from across the country, with widely different professional expertise in politics, business, labor, the academy, and government. From Tom Watson Jr., the chairman of the board of IBM, to A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and from Jerry Joseph, president of the National Mental Health Association, to Edmund Burke, whose tenure as governor of California had ended with a loss to Ronald Reagan in 1966. Julian Zamora, a professor of sociology at Notre Dame University, who had helped lead the charge for Latino studies programs on campuses across the country, also served on the commission. And there were many others. The commission's chair was Benjamin Heinemann, an accomplished industrialist from Chicago and head of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroads. In addition to soliciting advice from experts and gathering research reports, the commission's primary investigative strategy involved convening local hearings in 17 cities and towns across the country, where commissioners invited local officials, activists, advocates, and most importantly, the poor themselves, to testify about their experiences. Commissioners also visited the homes of the poor. In his writing, the sociologist Erving Goffman has suggested that changing the context in which observers view a certain event or activity, quote, plays a crucial role in determining what it is they think is really going on. While a set of circumstances may not resonate within extant interpretive frames, Goffman says, face-to-face interactions can have a significant impact. Examining the exchanges between commissioners and witnesses using this framework reveals just how commissioners came to see poverty as a consequence of external factors rather than as the outcome of individual choices. In Quincy, Florida, for example, a tobacco farming town where the commission held hearings, residents faced low wages and sporadic unemployment. At the same time, according to testimony, owners punished workers, who were mostly African American, who sought employment away from the farms after the short growing season was over. As a result, families had to borrow money from their employers to survive during the off-season. Children as young as 11 and 12 also worked in the tobacco fields in Quincy, thus reducing the time they spent in school and in job training programs and diminishing their future employment prospects. Commissioner Otto Eckstein, a Harvard-trained economist and a member of Lyndon Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors, was moved by the testimony he heard in Quincy. Quincy's economy was, quote, essentially plantation, unquote, Eckstein had said, as power brokers maintained tight control over the labor force. Workers were, quote, exploited and trapped in a cycle of credit and free rent. That was but one example of the kind of testimony that led commissioners to conclude, quote, unemployment, underemployment, and low wages, all prime causes of poverty, are often rooted in discrimination. Even those programs which had been created as remedies were out of touch and ineffective. Many job training programs provided instruction in industries which were increasingly irrelevant. For many of the poor then, the commission concluded, the desire to work is strong, but the opportunities are not readily available, and unemployment or underemployment are often due to forces that cannot be controlled by the poor themselves. The experiences of visiting the houses of the poor also had particular salience for commissioners. For example, Otto Eckstein described the houses of the tobacco harvesters he visited in Quincy, Florida. Quote, we saw these unpainted wooden shacks of 2 or 3 or 4 rooms in which 12 or 14 people lived, which had no windows, just shutters, no indoor water. Most of them did not have inside toilets. If it rained or was cold out, they simply closed the shutters. While he had initially been, quote, skeptical about the usefulness of the home visits, Eckstein was overwhelmed by what he saw in Quincy. Poverty that was, quote, really much deeper than I have ever encountered in my life, unquote. The visits, Eckstein said, provided an invaluable frame of reference for the physical reality of poverty. Commissioner Asa Spaulding, an insurance executive from North Carolina, was also surprised by the dire conditions he observed in Quincy. Quote, I thought I knew something about poverty and the condition under which people lived, but what I saw, I haven't seen any place else. Tom Watson Jr., the chairman of the board of IBM, had called the conditions he saw over the course of his experience with the commission, quote, intolerable and appalling. These are just a few of the many examples of what commissioners heard and saw in cities and towns across the country in 1968 and 1969. For the commissioners, face-to-face interactions had exposed the dire conditions in which the poor lived. Quote, it is difficult to discuss analytically the consequences which stark poverty imposes on people's lives, the commission argued in its final report. But a visitor feels these consequences in a 2-room shack in the Kentucky Appalachians, inhabited by an unemployed miner, his wife, and his 7 children, or in seeing the ugly decay of urban tenements, or in the dirty hands and faces of rural children whose families depend for water on open wells which may go dry, unquote. Those conditions had severe effects on social and behavioral patterns. The Commission ultimately proposed a non-categorical guaranteed income supplement to replace or in addition to much of the existing welfare system. Quote, "It is time to design public policy to deal with the two basic facts of American poverty. The poor lack money, and most of them cannot increase their incomes themselves. These conditions can be remedied only when the government provides some minimum income to all of those in need." Three considerations made guaranteed income especially appealing to the Commission. First, it could be implemented quickly. Second, it could supplement the current welfare system, the current system of public assistance. And third, it could transcend certain structural inequities, including those caused by racial discrimination, for example, which had no immediate fix. When he entered office in 1969, intensifying social and economic tensions pushed Richard Nixon to consider guaranteed income as well. By the summer of 1969, Nixon had turned to guaranteed income as the centerpiece for a massive welfare reform proposal. Nixon's needs thus converged with the work of the Commission. Heinemann, the chair, became a, quote, close liaison to the administration. Robert Finch, Nixon's secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, told Heinemann, quote, "The work of the Commission will be a great contribution to the administration." In a televised speech on August 8, 1969, Nixon called for the overhaul of the nation's welfare system and the bureaucratic structures that supported it. At the core of his proposal, which was called the Family Assistance Plan, was the idea of eliminating needs-specific programs and services in favor of a consolidated guaranteed income. The President's Commission on Income Maintenance was, of course, not the only influence on Nixon's Family Assistance Plan. There were numerous others. In addition, to be sure, there were stark differences between the Commission's recommendations and Nixon's proposal, but those are topics for another presentation. In the end, the President's Commission on Income Maintenance had made significant and enduring contributions. Face-to-face interactions with the poor had changed the perspective of commissioners, challenged long-held assumptions, and shaped their ideas about policy. There is then much to be gained by studying just how the poor and their advocates shifted the views of those in power by telling their stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, for that really enlightening look back at a piece of history that I think many of us may not have known about. I know myself had not really examined that part of history at the time, so thank you again for shining a light on that for us. Next, we're going to have Almaz Zelleke talk about wages for housework, the Marxist-Feminist case for basic income.
Hi everyone, this is working. So in this presentation, I am going to discuss the Marxist-Feminist argument for basic income implicit in the 1970s international movement known as Wages for Housework. The Wages for Housework movement, in its official organizational status, was active for less than a decade. Like other historical precedents for basic income in the United States, including the 1930s Townsend movement for a basic pension, the welfare rights movements of the 1960s and 70s, and the guaranteed minimum income experiments of the 1970s, Wages for Housework was unsuccessful in achieving what I will characterize and defend, despite the movement's narrower slogan, as a basic income for all. Despite its failure, I argue that the Wages for Housework movement is critical to the basic income debate today, in part because of its confusing and misleading slogan, but mostly because the wages for housework demand was, as the basic income proposal is today, both a specific demand and a perspective that ought to have resonance in broader progressive struggles and in influencing the development of proposals for basic income. Now that basic income is, in the US and many parts of the world, on the political agenda. So the wages for housework movement was initiated in Italy in 1972 by the International Feminist Collective, a group founded by Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, Selma James, and Silvia Federici, among others. In Federici's words, its goal was to open a process of international feminist mobilization that would force the state to recognize that domestic work is work and to remunerate it accordingly. The IFC brought a Marxist revolutionary perspective to the place of housework in the larger system of capitalist domination, arguing that the foundation of productive waged male labor is unpaid reproductive female labor in the home, and that the emancipation of wage labor could only come through this recognition and through the emancipation of unwaged labor. Now, the Wages for Housework slogan suggested to some feminists at the time a desire to recognize women's natural place in the home and to keep her there through the payment of a wage. We hear this as well today as a critique of basic income by some feminists as well. But the slogan obscured the group's more radical goals: to make housework visible as work so that it can be rejected as work can be rejected, to revolutionize gender relations, and to demand the redistribution of capital to support social reproduction. The Wages for Housework movement was critical of middle-class feminist belief in what they called the myth of liberation through work outside the home, or through state-controlled commodification of care, demanding instead cash independent of the performance of waged or unwaged work. This is the basis of my reading of the Wages for Housework movement as a demand for a basic income. The Wages for Housework theorists identify two sources of women's oppression: patriarchy and capitalism, by which they mean industrial capitalism. Patriarchy has long historical roots, of course. Under earlier economic regimes prior to industrial capitalism, men were, to be sure, despotic heads of the patriarchal family, but all members of serf or peasant families shared the same unfreedom vis-a-vis capital, that is, vis-a-vis landowners, and that was not distinguished by gender. But under capitalism, men became free and independent wage earners, creating a new form of dependency of women, children, the aged, and the disabled on wage-earning men. Capital's exploitation of labor remains consistent across economic regime types, but becomes intensified and gendered under industrial capitalism. So this is the basis of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa's claim that all women are housewives. And I'll get to that in a moment. But her point is that the family has been reduced from households in which all participate in productive and reproductive work and are seen to contribute to that, more or less equally, and divided by gender into wage earners and those who serve them. So the exploitation of unwaged labor, they argued, is organized and disciplined by the wage and by the wage earner. In Dalla Costa's words, to the extent to which capital has recruited the man and turned him into a wage laborer, it has created a fracture between him and all the other proletarians without a wage, who, not participating directly in social production, were thus presumed to be incapable of being the subjects of social revolt. The result of industrial capitalism's separation of productive and reproductive work is that reproductive work is no longer seen as work. Again, in Dalla Costa's words, where women are concerned, their labor appears to be a personal service outside of capital. This exploitation of unwaged labor is obscured by ideology. The ideology of patriarchy and the natural inclination, supposedly, of women to devote themselves to reproductive labor, not just the act of reproduction, but to caring for others in the family. Wages for housework theorists make clear that this view of unwaged reproductive labor has its roots in Marxist theory, of which they were both adherents but also critical, in which reproductive labor is seen as having only use value and not the exchange value of wage labor. One of the, I think, most important insights that their work gives us is that it highlights the fact that under industrial capitalism, capital is seen as the force of the people who control the means of production and control the ability of wage labor to work for its wages. Capital sheds its former responsibility for the reproduction of labor and displaces it to women and then to the state. So what that means is that under agrarian serfdom and peasant societies, even under slave societies, the owners of capital, the owners of the slaves, paid for the full reproductive costs of their peasants and their slaves. It sounds odd to us to say this, but in fact the system can't survive unless the owners of slaves and the lords of serfs are giving at least enough back to those workers so that they can reproduce. Under industrial capitalism, capital has shed that responsibility. Capital is no longer required to pay a living wage to its workers. Partly, they argue, because the costs of social reproduction have been displaced to women in the family who do this work for no wages, and regardless of how much income or earnings are reduced by employers, are expected to make do, to economize, to make their family survive. And then we can see this is instantiated in the so-called family wage, particularly in the 20th century, when this ideology of women staying home to serve wage earners was dominant, and industrial male wage earners were expected and used their power to organize, to demand, in some cases to win a family wage, a wage that would be enough to support the family. But the logic of capitalism and the wage relationship, and this is really these theorists' insight, is that the wage is always going to be forced down to the actual productivity of the labor rather than to some posited family wage, right? Because that's the logic of the wage relationship. And so after the family wage begins to go away, right, to fail to provide for the costs of reproduction, then that cost is displaced to the state. The state meaning the government that then provides social assistance and social welfare programs that are financed by taxes, and largely by taxes on income rather than by taxes on capital. The wages for housework theorists make it clear that even though women are the subjects of their activism, it's not only housewives who are disciplined by men, but wage earners, husbands, are disciplined by their families. They're disciplined by their families to submit to work, because if they want to challenge their employers and they challenge the wage relationship, they have to go home and face the family that has nothing and no one to survive on but the wage earners, right? So they argue that this is a way that men are also disciplined by capital to work. Housewives are excluded from unions and class struggle, and this is one of the things that they wanted to change. They wanted women to organize, to demand change for themselves. But even those wage earners who are the subjects of leftist class struggle and unionized class struggle, they risk, through their exclusion of women and others who do not achieve that kind of status, they risk being replaced because they've created for themselves a reserve army of possible wage earners who, if their demands become too strong, too high, can be substituted for them at work, as in fact has happened. We've seen that happen. And finally, wage-earning women are also housewives, because even if they have jobs outside the home, they are expected when they come home, particularly in the 1970s, this was very clear, to continue to serve their husbands and their families in unpaid labor through a second shift. They're expected to provide emotional labor in the workplace, and they often, the jobs that they have are often in care professions as well. And one of the ways that they talk about the fact that all women, even if they think they've been liberated from domestic work and from unwaged labor in the home, are still expected to provide unpaid emotional labor, is to ask what woman has not heard as she's walked in the street or bought a ticket or gone into a store, "Smile, honey, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you smiling?" Right? Women are expected to smile whenever men demand it of them. Okay, so the argument is that not only is this a revolutionary perspective, but it is the only revolutionary perspective, not just for women, but for the entire working class. Because as long as unwaged labor is exploited, wage labor is exploited as well. So wages for housework, again, is both a demand for wages, and I'll get to exactly what that means in a moment, and a revolutionary perspective that rejects alternatives to dealing with care and dealing with this unwaged reproductive labor that don't make capital pay. Right? So they reject this, as I said, this myth of liberation through work. They reject the private commodification of care work, so women paying other women to take care, to perform their care work for them while they're out working. They reject also the socialization of care work, and they reject the liberation of high-status women in the global north, particularly through the globalization of care work to women of the global south. Instead, their remedies included the reconstitution of women as a unified group without class, race, sexuality, national, or wage-earning divisions. And in fact, during the movement, they encouraged subgroups to form within the Wages for Housework movement, Black Women for Wages for Housework, and a group that called itself Wages Due Lesbians as well. There's a whole aspect of their critique that's about sexuality, which I won't get into here. Okay, so the reconstitution of women as a unified group without any divisions, the organization of women to overcome their isolation in the home and to articulate their collective demands, just as wage earners do through work activism and unionization, and then wages for housework, which means what exactly? Right, so this is the complicated part, and I think in many ways the reason that this movement did not succeed, not only at the time, but also has not had very much attention paid to it in history until now. There's beginning to be a revival of interest in this, not just by me, but by others as well. So here's where we come to the tension in the Wages for Housework mission and the slogan. The tension between what could be seen as a reformist demand for compensation, which some might argue could be met with a stipend for reproductive labor, perhaps a participation income, or an expanded EITC that's my timer.
You can go for another one.
That covers the parents of small children as well as wage earners. But the articulation of a particular demand seems to have been a secondary goal for the group to the mobilization of women to develop and articulate their own demands. A goal that, if we are to judge by the history, did not succeed. One mainstream feminist at the time, Carol Lopage, critiqued the Wages for Housework demand and implicitly critiqued the National Welfare Rights Organization movement that was active at the time, that FAP was being considered in the Nixon administration. And she critiqued the demand for money for women who were staying at home and not working in the workplace, because she said we all know that this money would come from the working class, and the working class isn't going to want that. And the response from the wages for housework theorists was, yes, absolutely, that's not what we want. And if we assume that every struggle ends up inevitably in a redistribution of poverty, rather than on an attack on capital's profit, we assume a priori the defeat of the working class. So the really important thing to remember is that even though the demand is structured as something that sounds like a stipend for housework, what the wages for housework movement was really looking for was what we've come to call a universal basic income. Because it was for women, it had to, of course, be individual, it couldn't be family-based. It had to be unconditional, not conditional on work. It had to be universal, although universal both nationally and internationally, because they were already in the 1970s worried about the globalization of care, which has come to really characterize so much of care work in the global north. And they wanted it to be financed by the redistribution of capital, not of income. They also wanted to be paid in cash rather than in kind or through public provision. So they're rejecting not only the kind of liberal approach of a stipend and not really attacking the problem, not really dealing with the problem, but just sort of paying it off, hush money, as some feminist critics of basic income call it, but also they're rejecting what we sometimes call the Swedish model of institutionalized care provided by the state. They didn't want the state, which they saw, like Marx, as only the handmaiden to capital, to control how their children were educated or fed or their elders were taken care of. They wanted the ability to make those decisions themselves. And they wanted it to be large enough not only to have the power to say no to employment, but to have the power to say yes to the things that women and men autonomously wanted to do with their time, rather than being told by capital how they had to spend their time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Almaz, for a really interesting look back and retelling and also providing an updated lens to how to view the wages for housework movement and sharing that with us. Next, we're going to have Jessica Church, who's going to share the Theology of Caregiving and Human Vulnerability, a proposal in favor of UBI.
Hello. Thank you guys for being here. So I'm a master's student at Yale Divinity School, and this will be, I think, a little different than most of the presentations today, but I hope that it's thought-provoking, to say the least. Is this working? Yes? No?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I want to start this presentation with an ancient story from the book of Ruth, found in the Hebrew Bible and Christian Old Testament. It begins with a woman, Naomi, who is left with 2 sons after her husband dies. They each marry, but then misfortune strikes again when both of her sons pass away and she is left with only her daughters-in-law. Seeking security and food, Naomi decides to return to her homeland. Rather than allowing her to travel alone, one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, goes with her. They arrive in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Both of these women have suffered loss. Ruth has lost her husband, Naomi has lost her husband and both sons, and still they cling to one another as family, providing care and comfort. Once in Bethlehem, Ruth encounters Boaz, an extended relative of Naomi. Boaz sees that Ruth has little, yet she has cared dutifully for her mother-in-law. He offers her some food and respite. She stays near him, and he continues to care for her until they are eventually married. Soon after, Ruth bears a son and gives him to Naomi, who becomes his wet nurse. The women of the neighborhood, another network of informal support, name him Obed. I tell this story because it illustrates that the challenges of caregiving span millennia. Intergenerational and interfamilial, temporary and long-term, creative caregiving arrangements have existed as long as humanity has. Due to their respective vulnerabilities, Naomi, Ruth, and Obed all depend on the care of their social networks at various points in the story. Humans are vulnerable beings. Accordingly, we need and deserve high quality and compassionate care at various points throughout our lives. For most, this occurs when we are very young and again when we are very old. Sickness and short or long-term disability may increase these needs still, and some remain dependent on the care of others for their entire lives. In fact, This dependence and interdependence is a defining part of what makes us human. But American feminist philosopher Eva Feder-Kate notes that we exist within, quote, a political and economic arrangement which distributes rights and freedoms to those who participate in the public, political, and economic order, end quote. As such, our capitalist logic would have us believe that the need for care is a liability, something to be avoided at all costs. Drawing on the historical and genealogical work of Nancy Fraser and Linda Gordon, dependency has been, quote, pathologized, feminized, and racialized, end quote. I am asking us to think differently. In this short paper, I seek to articulate that vulnerability and its subsequent dependency are good and joyful things to be embraced rather than ignored or avoided. As such, all persons, regardless of race, ethnicity, income, ability, gender, or social location, should be able to choose how and from whom they and their loved ones receive care over the course of their lives. I will primarily be working within the Christian doctrine of creation and the Christian doctrine of incarnation. And to close, I will make an enthusiastic proposal for universal basic income as one way to address these market failures. The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, Latin for creation out of nothing, emerged as a Christian teaching in the late 2nd century. Until this time, church teaching held that God created the world from pre-existing material, but for Theophilus of Antioch and subsequent church fathers, this pre-existing material set limits on what God was able to create, and this was unacceptable. So a position was developed that reflected God's utter sovereignty, one where all things' existence depended wholly on God. It is worth noting that the doctrine of creation from nothing, quote, is also upheld by Jews and Muslims. That's Ian McFarland. This is an important point of convergence for the 3 Abrahamic faiths, in part because it enables dialogue on the basis that all humans hold an inherent dignity in the fact that they were created by God alone. If we are created out of nothing, as a doctrine contends, then nothing limits God. No rules, no pre-existing material, no parameters or restrictions. God did not have to create the world, but chose to do so out of love and desire. We can conclude then that humans, with all their creaturely limitations, are exactly as God intended them to be. In other words, vulnerability is indeed our original condition. And the reality of this vulnerability means that we need help from others. We are literally dependent upon one another to meet our basic survival needs, and even more so to thrive. This view that humans are fundamentally dependent is echoed in Eva Feder-Kate's work. In her book, Love's Labor, she writes, quote, "These are unassailable facts about human existence. While conditioned in fundamentally significant ways by cultural consideration, dependency for humans is as unavoidable as birth and death are for all living organisms," end quote. Some Christians counter this by arguing that our creaturely vulnerability, especially our ability to feel pain and suffering, is a negative consequence of the fall. As the creation story goes, Adam and Eve disobeyed God's orders, and now we're cursed. But we must disabuse ourselves of the notion that the need for protection and help, especially resulting from physical or mental disability, is a consequence of sin. The late theologian and disability scholar Nancy Iceland, who lived her life wheelchair-bound due to a congenital bone defect, wrote that people inquired about her hidden sins when she was a young child. This line of thinking has done great damage to the disability community within and outside of the church. Instead, it is in the pious acknowledgement of our creaturely limitations that we come to understand the necessary dependence and interdependence of human life. The Christian faith gives us a powerful example of dependency and vulnerability in none other than Jesus Christ. In an article entitled "A Truly Human Incarnation, Recovering a Place for Nativity in Contemporary Theology," Catholic theologian Elizabeth O'Donnell Gandolfo reminds us that, quote, "The liberating good news of divine incarnation does not begin with Jesus' public ministry as an adult. Rather, it begins with a socially high-risk pregnancy, with a humble, messy, and painful birth, and with the natal body of a squalling, dependent, and vulnerable infant," end quote. Gandolfo's raw and unrestrained account of Jesus' gestation and birth shocks us into remembering that he did not appear out of thin air. Like the rest of us, he depended on someone to raise and care for him. He needed to be fed and changed, soothed and entertained, just like the babies we've had the privilege of encountering in our own lives. Mary, his mother, took on the role of first teacher. I can just imagine 3-year-old Jesus getting a scolding for coming too close to an open fire or wandering too far from the adults. Those early years are a time of enormous brain development, especially for the acquisition of social and emotional skills. In other words, even Jesus needed childcare. If we accept that vulnerability and dependency are intended by God and therefore holy, then it follows that sin is found in the inverse. In our society, I see sin exhibited in 2 main ways. First, we sin when we seek to avoid, paper over, or otherwise escape our creaturely vulnerability. Gandolfo writes, quote, "Indeed, the relentless and blind pursuit of invulnerability destroys human bodies and spirits," end quote. This is embedded within our obsessions with youth, technology, and independence, all of which further alienates us from God and others. Second, sin manifests in behavior that takes advantage of or exploits human vulnerability. This might look like physical abuse, neglect, or simply the withholding of care and attention that a person needs to thrive. This also includes structural impediments to accessing high-quality childcare, elder care, or disability assistance. To redeem us from these sins of alienation and exploitation, we must build systems that attend to our human vulnerability. After all, it is the milieu in which we experience both suffering and redemption. The key word here is redemption. Christians understand this term to mean deliverance from sin, and I see redemption as a reorienting toward God and others, a repositioning that embraces our dependency and interdependency. What then does this mean for caregiving? Children, the sick, the elderly, and persons with disabilities need and deserve care that is reliable, tailored to their needs, and safe. High-quality care is also compassionate and developmentally appropriate. As Kate writes, quote, "Dependency work is labor that enhances the power and activity of another," end quote. Persons deserve the right to make their own decisions about how they meet these needs. In our childcare space, for example, parents can choose between a childcare center, what most folks would refer to as daycare, a family home care provider. This might look like a woman caring for several children in her home, essentially as a small business, a family friend or neighbor arrangement, what the childcare field sort of refers to as FFN care, or a nanny if you're really lucky. Parents ought to be able to choose the best arrangement for their child, and this is doubly true for children with special needs. This dignity of choice must be protected across all socioeconomic locations. I regularly receive criticism from my peers at Yale Divinity School when I make the leap from theological exposition to policy proposals because my solutions are never quite good enough. In their minds, it should look more like the kingdom of God and less like something from a Washington, D.C. think tank. But I come by this tendency honestly. Prior to my graduate work, I spent 5 years working in politics and issue advocacy with a stint at the National Women's Law Center as an advocacy manager for their child care, tax, and budget work. This hands-on experience helps me think through the many ways that theological ideas, like those outlined above, can inform our public policy with an eye towards justice. I have previously made the case that vulnerability is a defining characteristic of humanity. As such, the need for care is universal. But in what many Christians believe to be a flawed and fallen world, a person's socioeconomic standing directly influences how much agency they have to make decisions about the care they need. And so in our current political and economic system, how might we enhance people's ability to choose the high-quality care that they or their loved ones deserve? One way is to implement universal basic income. UBI has the potential to serve as a leveling force. By this, I do not mean that it will completely flatten the playing field, but it will significantly enhance economically marginalized people's ability to make decisions that are best for them when it comes to caregiving and care receiving. Moreover, it would force us to reevaluate and reimagine what it means to receive assistance from or to be dependent on the government. A standard universal basic income proposal could provide $1,000 a month to all adults age 18 and over. One of the biggest beneficiaries of this policy would be women who cannot or otherwise do not work because they're caring for a child or other loved one. Even so, 7 in 10 mothers are still in the workforce, and this monthly dispensation could offset the cost of childcare. According to the National Women's Law Center, the average annual cost of full-time care for one child ranges from nearly $3,000 on the very low end to over $20,000, depending on the age of the child, the type of care, and where the family lives. If presented with the option, I would endorse a proposal wherein individuals claiming dependents would receive a temporarily higher monthly payment than those without. These dependents could be children, aging parents, or other adults who are dependent due to health reasons. Like the current child tax credit, this would begin to recognize the value of caregiving labor by parents, grandparents, and others that ensures the rest of our economy continues to function. Eva Feder-Pate writes, quote, "I do not want to deny the important differences between paid and unpaid dependency work, but we should note that whatever dependency work we pay for today has, at some time, been done by women as part of their familial duty," end quote. And still, it remains undervalued as a vestige of this antiquated social order. This highlights another reason why my corrective solution, rooted in the Christian doctrines of creation and incarnation, makes use of public policy and the market. A solution that fails to compensate women for this care would only perpetuate the invisibility and devaluation of work that has historically been done by women, particularly women of color. As more women are remaining in the workforce after having children and more adults are living long into their 80s and 90s, I'm acutely aware of the cost of raising children and the cost of elder care in the United States. Families are squeezed. A solution coming in the form of cash transfers, which allow each person to choose how best to spend that money to access the necessary care for their loved ones, would move us collectively in the right direction. When we lean into our vulnerability, recognize our need for care, and provide means to access that care, we are engaging in redemptive work that is holy and good. Using public policy as a tool to make that happen is a practical and concrete way of getting us a little bit closer to a world that resembles the kingdom of God. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jessica, for doing an amazing job weaving together sort of the spiritual, religious aspect. Some things we take for granted and go to church or go to synagogue or whatever religion we believe in, not recognizing the very core values that you can identify and pull out from that, and I think connect that with the work that we're trying to do with UBI and the importance of the vulnerability that has been with us since the beginning of time, and how that really connects with what we're trying to do in helping others and addressing that with policies like UBI. So thank you for that. And finally, I'd like to introduce Victoria Lehman, who is going to be talking with us about basic income against the tsunami for senior and dementia care.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you. I was privileged to present in Hamilton on basically the dispossessed, disabled, racialized, and abused. In my 37 years as a lawyer, starting in the time of the Dauphin Project, because I'm also from Manitoba, and my cohort was involved in bringing it into effect and had the horrible disappointment of having it canceled by the next government, all through my years, where in fact I was representing these particular people. Among other things that I did as a lawyer. Now to see BIG coming back is tremendously inspiring. But now that I'm at this retirement post-practice period of my time, of my life, I find myself more and more drawn into the end life experience of individuals, and I am concerned about the burden on millennials and Gen X, or Gen Z, I think it's called, isn't it, Gen Z, who are in the gig economy, and even though as, what would I be called? What am I called? Boomer generation, I think, yeah. and often feeling like the ham or the jam in the sandwich, being pressed by the demands of family, children, and being pressed by the demands of the seniors in our family. I'm even more concerned about the next generation and what we may actually be confronting. Now, we don't have the lights here, and I don't have a audiovisual presentation. I've got about 2,500 words, and if I don't get through them, I don't get through them, but I'll give you what I have. In the last decade, in particular the past 4 years, I've been spending much of my time attending to family members and friends, many of whom also were clients, actually, from their 70s to their 90s, who are resident in personal care homes. And by that I'm referring to long-term care homes, which involves a great deal of frailty, including mental frailty and dementias. These are acute care beds, units, due to stroke, various progressive physical and mental ailments with no possible future positive prognoses. And that includes also Alzheimer's, for which, of course, we know there is no cure at this present time. Apart from myself and a few other regular attender families and friends, by and large, the residents receive very few visitors. People with relatively good health seem either too busy or, I think, too fearful to spend time with family members and friends who may not even register awareness of their surroundings, never mind the person in front of them, and be unable to communicate or to attend to their own needs, which can be very messy at times, because incontinence, of course, factors in, and are often thought not to benefit from the touch and presence of others. This is the sort of secular version of what my previous speaker has been speaking about. With the shrieks and moans emanating from the often parched throats of residents experiencing the terrors of dementia, and that is not an exaggeration. Family members often appear to flee as though from a zombie apocalypse. This is demonstrably wrong, of course, and ironically, the symptoms that they fear are often from the lack of both human touch and connection, having left the residents initially depressed and continuing depressed, desperate for their families and friends, and dissociated from the here and now, Martin Buber, the here and now, of reality. Anxiolytic medications, one would think, as I initially did, well, why aren't these people at least getting some medication to take away their terror? Because often what they're experiencing is a constant and undying terror. But anxiolytic medications are rarely prescribed as they are considered to create a risk of falling and injury. So people are left in this state. So the residents often experience a kind of hell in social isolation that creates an echo box of their own expressed needs, both emotional and physical, with no one to advocate for those needs. And what visitors observe is largely the consequences of this confinement. Often it is understood that the frail senior whose health declines sharply upon being alone and without the supports of family or friends, sometimes after a debilitating illness or injury, the death of a spouse, the passage of time as family members passed or drifted away, and also the fact that many people, particularly in the gig economy, have to go where they can to get what jobs they can to support themselves and their families. When I was a child, very often we had a stay-at-home mother who provided labor. I'm from the north end of Winnipeg, so poverty and Marxism were always in my face, and I was always being almost daily reminded of it as from what we saw. And the fact is, though, that women were considered to be an integral part of the working unit because without the economies that they provided by pioneers, even the women even made their own yarn as well as the clothes and food. But in terms of doing the daycare, doing the housekeeping, keeping the family going from the home end was actually between themselves and a wage earner. They were able to survive. Now there's the law of wages that talks about wages have to be pushed down into subsistence. But the fact is that people manage to at least subsist now, at this point in time, 2 wage earners seem to be needed even to cover the housing costs. And that's how far effectively we've fallen. All of the gains that were made in the post-World War II era that people thought were being made were basically eroded by the 70s and 80s until we are now a debt society. And we are in debt from the individual family unit right up, as we've been talking about, to basically the government that has basically kept the standard of living going by going progressively into debt. After the bankers took over in about 1974, of course it was a political decision. They were the ones who paid for the politicians' programs, and whatever fancy words they used, they ended up taking over interest and enriching themselves and impoverishing the country that built the infrastructure on basically a zero interest basis. So that, as well as the pavements that I'm walking on and tripping on because they haven't been improved for the last 50 years, basically that's a prime example of the fact that that all governments are now crying that there is no more money. However, things can get much worse unless something is done, and we're of course advocating basic income. So this situation is rarely voluntary and often experienced as shameful. We still live in largely a shame-based society. It is also often most thrust on a person by time and circumstance. There may be family members in the back of the picture, but the circles of connection become increasingly drawn due to smaller family numbers, less people to look after, all ages within our generations, and the financial necessity of earning a living with little or no financial margin for attending to the needs of family members in need of any kind of support, and certainly social contact becomes secondary. It breaks the bonds of that formerly provided life and health to seniors and in fact to the entire community. As our population and those of many other developed countries such as Japan, for example, have tipped geographically to where there are more people over 65 than under 14 years of age, the numbers of individuals facing life with severe decline is on the rise. It is a terrifying prospect, as most of these illnesses do not augur any hope of improvement, as I've noted, and most of the sufferers know that as matters decline, that they may be alone and also wiped out financially. As a sidebar, Manitoba has a per diem situation. We are one of the most progressive in the world, and we have had the people who founded our long-term care funding programs. We're often consulted. One of the women, a professor at the University of Manitoba, her name escapes me, but she was often consulted until she passed away. And what we have is, there's no call on capital. If you go to BC, you have to use up all of your capital before you will be able to get any kind of government assistance. In Manitoba, your capital stays and you pay on the basis of your taxable income at the highest of about, I think, $83 a day. So that's how our system works. But even with that, you still need a tax base, you still need people who are actively working, paying taxes to be able to effectively subsidize this. And that's, of course, a concern. Research has shown, however, that diseases like dementia progress most rapidly when people are socially disconnected and their supports, including nutritional support usually comes with this, are deficient. Not being able to shop for healthy food, not being able or have someone do that for you, not being interested in cooking for one, lack of hydration, and without access to services such as Meals on Wheels for daily nutrition, creates a predictable downward spiral that can have permanent consequences on overall health and function, which tends to result in an earlier admission to long-term care, as the person appears to be. Even if a person presents at an emergency unit at a hospital disoriented, it may be that social workers caring people within the hospital system will assess that person as needy. They will not be able to go home. They will be, we call it paneled for care. And that often means staying for many weeks or months within a hospital setting, which of course is very expensive. Those go for, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, $500 to $800 a day to have a bed in a hospital, to be occupying a bed in a hospital at the very least, just for minimum services I'm talking about, not for anything acute. So that again is also a cost to the community and a cost to the tax base. The age disparity of the population of developed countries has declined to such a pace that in 2016, the sales of adult diapers outsold baby diapers. And in these circumstances, apparently 25% of Texas millennials have recently reported in the press to be unpaid caregivers, and many have a great challenge finding productive and paying employment for themselves. Again, that gig economy. The provision of basic income would provide these millennials with the opportunity to be paid for the productive work that we call emotional labor. Emotional labor is defined, in my understanding, of all work that it takes that would otherwise effectively be considered altruistic. All the work that it takes to help other people function, and usually at the expense of oneself. That's the work necessary to support others and oneself, and to date, never paid by the receiver, and at a cost to the provider. Women have been considered the main providers of emotional labor to their spouses, immediate families, extended families, co-workers, etc. So all that you have to ask, one of the tests that you have to ask is, who makes the doctor's appointments in the family? Who makes sure that everybody has enough to eat? Who makes sure that everybody has clothes to wear and that they're washed? It is a very egalitarian family where the adults at least have to do their own. I recall when I was a student in grad school, staying on a farm, and I was the only girl of four boys and a girl, and they would come back and they'd say, "Where's supper?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm not here to provide your supper." But the fact was there was an expectation. I realized that was the reason that they wanted a girl. That's emotional labor. That's emotional labor. That's emotional labor that some of us have been opting out of for years. But be that as it may, there are other times when we haven't, because we know it's important to keep people and families going. It depends upon the availability and willingness of a family members to give up financial and social opportunities, personal comforts, and both their present and future financial security in favor of what they perceive to be the more primary concern of being a care provider, including a healthcare provider, and caring for a loved one. And of course, I'm referring at the present time generally, but more specifically in my paper, to senior members who are at need. And not only is there no pay for that very real emotional labor, being work done for the emotional well-being of family and friends, and most often produced so silently and effectively that the recipient takes the efforts completely for granted, as if they're done by a hidden force of fairies, but largely without respite. And there's no fund for it. This can exact a great cost in the health and both present and future finances of the provider. In fact, there's a saying among those who provide emotional labor as caregivers to a frail senior that they are the ones who become ill or even die before the person for whom they are caring. And we see that in spousal dyads. Basic income can assist in providing respite and compensate for the expenses otherwise payable for the caregiver. I'll move on because I think I'm told that I have how many minutes? 2 minutes? Okay. Well, I can make this actually really quite short. The paper itself is part of, thank you, Michael Howard. I submitted the paper to you, so I'm sure it's in there. In conclusion, a basic income guarantee would support those caring for frail seniors living in their homes or with family members, so that these frail seniors could avoid institutional care that may be prohibitive to them even to the tax base, and to keep them out of long-term care units as long as possible, because that is the goal. It would also indirectly and directly provide financial support for communities threatened by economic and technical disruption, by maintaining critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and by directly supporting local businesses, by keeping people in the community so that they don't have to go far away and have their own expenses and dissociation in having to set up a family life, sometimes states or provinces away. This would also avert this migration to larger centers that are already experiencing overcapacity to the degree of violence from, I would propose, the fact that people are having to live in such close constraints with each other. With regard to sustaining seniors at the point of already being too frail to manage without institutional care, as well as the unemployed and insecurely employed and their families. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. I know we have a quick couple of minutes left to get some questions, so I'm going to try the new version of 3 at a time. I'm going to run around with this microphone as well. And then we have a quick announcement at the very end, so don't leave until we're just totally wrapped up. Oh, yeah. You can use both. So, okay, grab that one and I'll go the other side. So we'll just do, let's see, so Floyd, and then in the back. And was there a third hand over there?
Question about the basic income movement in the 60s and 70s. I heard so many theories as to why it fizzled out, including Martin Luther King was no longer around to agitate for it. Something about the divorce rate went up in some trials, it became a political non-starter. Like, what's the reason why it fizzled out after Nixon's administration?
I think I can speak to at least Dauphin in Canada. The pretext was that it was splitting up families, that the divorce rate was rising. And of course the reason the divorce rate was rising, or the separation rate, was because people didn't have to stay in abusive and unproductive families. They actually had a few dollars to afford for rent on their own and to be able to take their children out. And when I heard today that with this present experiment, the spousal abuse centers were emptying out, that they had free beds, that is more than I would have ever dreamed to be able to happen in my 37 years of dealing with the issue we call wife abuse. So, but the other issue was, and this is what's not spoken, is that at that time, and this is before computers, basically, right? We're talking about 1969, 70, you know, the 60s. There was a very strong, and I'm a pro-union person, there was a very strong unionized element of people who worked within the agencies in the government who were in the social welfare area and supported this. They were concerned that there would be massive unemployment. However, now we have a workforce, and with technology, right, we barely are able to find enough people, depending on your area, to actually fill these positions. So I want to point out that there's a huge sea change there, that the reasons that were used at the time are not even any relevant now because of the early parts of disruptive technology.
Thank you. This is for Almaz. One of your points earlier was that the international feminist movement, one of their remedies was to reconstitute women as a unified group. But at the same time, they encouraged subgroups based on race, based on sexuality. So I was wondering how the movement itself articulated this seemingly contradictory claims, and then also how you would analyze that.
My question is for Almaz. I'm wondering, it's really, really interesting. Everything everyone said is so interesting. I'm wondering about the wages for housework, and I was sitting here thinking about Roe v. Wade, 1972. And so I'm wondering from, what I'm hearing about, what I'm thinking about right now with regards to wages for housework is I would imagine that that abortion was viewed rather problematically. I can't see how it would be considered a freedom issue. I think there would be a way you could construe that it was somehow not the right solution to what they wanted. And I'm just curious, it must have come up, and I'd like to know, to educate myself a little more about what they thought about abortion and demographic change, I guess, wasn't on the horizon yet, but I'd like to know a little more about about all of this?
One more question.
This is for, I think, Jessica from Yale. So I'm curious, that's fantastic. Have you presented that in front of a religious audience? And if so, what was their reaction? If not, what would you imagine their reaction to be?
Sure, I'll address really quickly the history in the late 60s and early 70s, at least in the United States. I think one of the main things that's becoming apparent in a lot of the sessions today is after the Family Assistance Plan fails to get through Congress, which is for a variety of fairly complicated political reasons, what becomes clear both in Johnson's commissions, the commissions that came before, as well as FAP and its aftermath, is there's no agreement on what the program looks like. So among the complexities that they never answer from a policy point of view is, does it replace the existing welfare system or does it supplement it? If it replaces it, what parts does it replace? So there are disputes about what the minimum guarantee should be. The poverty line is a moving target. So there doesn't get to be a whole lot of consensus after Nixon fails to push through the Family Assistance Plan on what basic income should be defined as. And then the country's politics, maybe 2 or 3 years later, move in a direction that's quite different from the political window that UBI had offered.
I have a slightly different answer to that question as well. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting when you look into the debates in the Nixon administration about FAP is that it's almost unimaginable to think about it in today's administration. These kinds of conversations going on. I mean, there were people who were really thoughtful about what the issues were, and would work go away? Would people stop working? What would happen to the family? This conversation, was ongoing among many of the prominent people in the administration. One of the factions really that was wanted workers to be more disciplined for work. I think won out within the Nixon administration, and then also Senator Russell Long, Huey Long's son, ironically, who was also opposed to unconditional support, and after the demise of FAP, pushed through the first EITC. That was his preferred alternative, was supplements of low wages rather than an unconditional basic income. But it is a complicated time, and there's a lot going on. In terms of the tension between this idea in the Wages for Housework movement between unifying women and encouraging subgroups. The idea of encouraging the subgroups was that so a group of white, more privileged women would not be speaking for, and heterosexual women would not be speaking for African American women or other minorities in other countries, or for lesbians, but they were encouraged to speak for themselves, so to create subgroups within a larger group. But really the idea was to stop the division which they saw happening in the larger mainstream women's movement between women who were able to go out into the workforce and to liberate themselves from housework that way, and those who either did not have that option because of education or training, or because they had to do both. So that was really what they were trying to unify. And then on abortion, yes, there's a lot about contraception, access to abortion, sexuality, which, as I said, I didn't really go into in the short presentation. But they wanted both access to free and reliable contraception and access to abortions. They wanted women's decisions about their own reproductive health and about whether to have children, how many children to have, to be women's choices, very explicitly.
Amy, thank you for that question. So in the interest of modeling vulnerability, I have never presented a paper at a conference before today, so no, I haven't. I do talk about childcare and vulnerability and these topics a lot with professors, and I shared this paper with one of our associate deans and some peers and a professor before coming here. And it got really good feedback. I think where I differ from a lot of my peers is that they see any kind of wheeling and dealing, coalition building, negotiating, compromising as like inherently dirty and wrong, and like they want to remain above that. And I just, it doesn't bother me. I think it's part of how you actually make like concrete change, so.
Great, thank you. We have a quick announcement, and then we'll be done.
Hi, for those of you who weren't there this morning, and just a little bit more clarity, for Canadians, some of whom might not be able to stay till the planned session at the end on Sunday, we're going to meet very briefly, right at the beginning of the lunch period tomorrow, Sunday, in or around room 217, depending on whether it's being used or not. So as soon as lunch begins, it's 12:30 in the program, but you know, things happen. And like I said, we won't keep you, but we want to get people before we all run off and find good stuff to eat. Thank you.
Great, with that, let's please thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion, and thank you all so much.